And now let's move on to our next topic. Nice. And once we're familiar with route params and query string, let's really kick things into gear and talk about middleware in Express.js. Express middleware are functions that execute during the request to the server. Each middleware function has access to request and response objects. And when it comes to functionality, literally, sky is the limit. In order to hammer this home, I have prepared quite a few examples where we cover middleware step by step, since, in my opinion, actual code examples are far more helpful than text based explanations. Before we continue, though, let me just stress something. Middleware is literally everywhere in Express. You can even make an argument that Express apps are nothing but a bunch of middleware functions stuffed together to make one nice Express cake or dessert if you're in that sort of thing. And since that is the case, middleware is not one of those topics you can just skip or avoid. It is at the heart and soul of Express, so please don't dismiss it. With that said, since you'll encounter it more than once, if you struggle with it in the beginning, don't panic. The more examples you'll do, the better you will understand it. Now, let me start by cleaning out my app.js. And this is going to be the case where I will leave the code, at least some of the code, from the previous lecture. So let me delete all the middle part, and I'm just going to leave Express. We are instantiating our app, and we're listening on port 5000. And let's just start by adding a comment here for your reference. So there is a incoming request, and then so far we have been just sending responses, right? So what middleware does, it sits in between, hence the name. So middleware over here, and then we pass the response. So the request comes in, we'll do something. So we'll have access to the both, to the request and response. We'll do some kind of functionality. Again, the most basic, you can just console log something. And then we'll send out the response. And again, I know it probably looks confusing at the moment, but trust me, the more examples you'll do, the better you'll understand it. And let's start by simple scenario where I have two routes. I have the home route and I have the about route. And in those routes, I would just want to log the method that the user is using, the URL that the user is trying to access, and for example, a date. And if you think that's silly, there's actually npm packages that do that, because as your Express apps grow bigger and bigger, it is very useful to see those incoming requests in that manner. So let's start here by setting up app.get. Again, this is going to be my home page. And for the time being, I have my callback function. I pass it in and I just go with the res.send and I send back the home. And I'll do the same thing here with my about. So there's going to be two routes at the moment, home and about. And this is just going to say about. So I'll save it, and it's not going to be surprised if I navigate to localhost 5000. If I refresh, this is my home and this is my about. Again, something we have covered already before. Now, here's the kicker. If I go with logger, and if I set up that functionality in the route for the homepage, I'll also have to do that in the about. So let me showcase that. So I have a request object, and in there I have method, I have URL, and I'll simply set up the year because I don't want to deal with JavaScript time. So let's go with method. Now that one was on request.method property. Then we also have the URL. So URL here, and that is going to be a request URL property, like so. And then, like I said, I'm going to go with const, and I'll name this time, but in order to make it easier, I'm actually going to get a full year. So I'm going to go with new date, and I'll invoke it, and I'll say get full year and invoke it as well. And of course, I'm sending back home. Yeah, that is nice. But before I do anything, I would also want to console log all three of them. So method, URL, as well as the time, like so. So I save it, and now every time the user is going to hit this resource, of course, I'll see that in a console log. So there it is. If I go back to my homepage like so. And if I refresh quite a few times, there it is. Now in the console, I can see that the method was get. So the user was trying to get the resource, and then the path was the homepage. That's my URL. And then the year is 2021. Okay, awesome. But here's the problem. If I want to have the same functionality in about, what do I need to do right now? Well, again, I need to copy and paste. Now, if I have 15 routes, does that sound like a reasonable approach? And of course, the answer is no. A better solution would be if we set up a function. And in that function, we have all this logic, and then I can just attach it willy-nilly to all my routes. And when I say willy-nilly, it just means that for some routes, I maybe want to attach it, and for some, maybe I don't. So here's the deal. I can go above both of my routes, and I can just simply say that there's going to be a function by the name of logger. And for the time being, we're not going to look for any parameters, but yes, they will be there. And then we just take all our, I believe, 4 lines of code, right? And we just cut it out and pass it here. Okay, awesome. And now, of course, where do we attach this function? So we don't have to duplicate our code. And the place is following, where we have the path, and then we have the callback function. Now, in between them, we can stuck a middleware. So in this case, as you can see, I'm referencing the function. Please keep that in mind. So I'm going to go with logger. That's my middleware function. But now there's the second question. Well, in the logger, I'm accessing request object, right? So how can I do that? Because at the moment, I'm not passing it in. Well, the good news is that express passes it into our middleware function. So in here, I just set up the reference for my function, and express will do that behind the scenes. It will supply the rec, res, and also a next. And you'll see in a second why we need this next function as well. So again, we don't have to do anything. We just pass here the middleware. Express supplies them. But of course, it's our job to access them as parameters and then set up our logic. So for the time being, I'm not going to do anything with next. I will save, and we should see something where in the console, I'm still going to get my log, but the problem is going to be in the browser. So if I navigate back and if I refresh, notice something where I have this spinner. Okay, so what's happening here? Well, I successfully logged, but I didn't pass it on to the next middleware. So here's the deal. When you work with middleware, you must pass it on to a next middleware unless you're terminating the whole cycle by sending back the response. And don't worry, there's going to be examples where we do that as well. So for now, just keep in mind that when you have a middleware where you set up some kind of logic, unless you're sending back the response yourself, for example, since I have access to response, I simply can go with res dot and send. And again, I'm going to come up with testing or whatever. It doesn't really matter what we send back. If we refresh notice, doesn't really matter if I try to access the homepage. Since I have my middleware, I'm actually sending back the testing. And this is why the middleware is so powerful, because you can literally do whatever you want over here. You can set up all kinds of cool logic, and you have 2 options. Either you pass it on to the next middleware, which in our case, of course, are going to be our methods, our get methods, or you simply terminate the whole cycle and you just say res.send, and I'm sending back my own data. So let's not be brutal over here. I will actually remove this line of code. And if I want to pass it on to the next function, meaning in our case, that is going to be my method app.get, I simply go with next and we have to invoke it. Again, please keep that in mind. There's going to be more functionality later in these middleware functions, but you always, either you terminate, so either you send back your own response or you pass it on to the next middleware. That is very crucial. So now if I go again to my homepage, there it is. I successfully navigate to my homepage. I can clearly see that. That is my response. And I also successfully log in my console the method, the URL, as well as the full year. And now, of course, instead of adding this logic line by line to every request, simply can go and I say, yep, I would like to invoke the logger here as well. So if we go to localhost 5000, and if we're brave enough and we navigate to about, there it is. Now I have get request, about URL, as well as the full year. Hopefully that gives you a good initial understanding how the middleware works. And now we can talk about more complicated topics. Beautiful. We are familiar with the middleware. We have our first middleware function, but there are two issues with this current setup. First, our app.js is getting somewhat clunky because, we have this logger, then we have the methods. It's definitely nicer if we have this logger function in a separate file. It's just going to keep our app.js lean, and in turn, it's just going to make it easier for us to navigate and essentially work with our application. And the second issue, what if I have 50 more routes? And I don't want to add this function manually to all of them. Wouldn't it be nicer if there would be a method that essentially just adds my middleware function to any route? And of course, the answer is yes, there is such a function. In fact, we used it a few videos ago. Now, let's start though by moving this sucker into a separate file. So I'm going to go to my, not navbar app, sorry. This is what happens when you have a bunch of projects open, meaning a bunch of folders open. Let me go here where I have my app.js, and I'm just going to create a new file. And this is still going to create it in the final, sorry. So let me go here and I'll create a new file and I'll call this logger.js. Now, if you really want, you can add the middleware there in the name as well. But in my case, I'm just going to add the name of my function. Then I'll cut it out. And what's really cool that we know how to export this, right? So we have const logger, and then we go with module exports, and we'll just set it equal to our logger. So now we have default export, that's our logger. So of course, in the app.js, I simply need to go with const logger is equal. And then I require it. I go with logger. And if I navigate to localhost 5000, I still should see in a console my log. And if you do, then everything is correct. So that's the first part. Now the second, how can I apply this logger to all my routes? So for example, let me just copy and paste these ones, and I'll say API and then product and then API and I don't know, not about, maybe items. Again, doesn't really matter what you place here. I'm going to go with products as well as items. Again, I can add them manually, but the more routes I'm going to have, well, the bigger issue this is going to become, right? Because for every route, I need to manually add this logger. So a better solution is this one, where I select all of them. I just remove them like so. Now, of course, if I go to any of these routes, I'm not going to have anything in a console, but there is a method by the name of app.use. And in that app.use, this is what we do. We pass in the middleware. So we simply go with logger. And once I save, check it out. Now, if I go to about, for example, or if I go to home or API and then products, and hopefully you get an idea, all the time you'll get this log in console. Why? Well, because app.use will invoke this for any route. Now, please do keep in mind two things. First, order matters here. If I'm going to place this below app.get, and if I'm going to try to do that in a home page, I'm not going to see anything in the console. Why? Well, because I invoke my use only after get. And in Express, everything goes in order. So if app get is before the use one, the one that applies to all the routes, then yes. Well, first we'll hit the home route and then we'll send back home. So there is no logger. So that's why you'll see all the middleware functions, all the app.uses at the top of the document. So you'll have your middleware functions first, and only then you'll have all your route methods, whether that's get, post, and you get an idea. So that's the first thing that I would like to mention. Now, the second thing that I would like to mention is the fact that we can add here a path. So if I go to app.use, that's my method, and instead of providing only one argument, which in my case is the logger, I can set up a first one, and that is going to be path. And I just need to come up with a value. Now, in my case, I'm going to type API, and you'll see in a second why. So if you save with an API, you'll notice something interesting, where this is going to be applied to both of them, to the products as well as the items. So here's the deal. Once you apply this path over here, basically it's gonna apply to any route after this API. So for example, if I go with API and then some crazy one, home, about, and then products, all the time it's gonna keep on applying this middleware. So that's something new, right? Because previously we worked only with a specific route. So / or about or products here in this case. So of course these are different. Now when we add this path to use, then of course it's going to be applied pretty much to anything that comes after the path that you provide over here. So in my case, since I provided API, then of course it's going to go for any path that's after that. Now, if you want to find out more info about app.use, I suggest navigating to docs again. We're looking for API reference. In our case, that is 4. And if you take a look at the app.use, mounts specified middleware function or functions, and we're going to cover that later as well, at the specified path. And middleware function is executed when the base of the request path matches. So this is going to be our base. And then whatever comes after will still invoke that middleware function. And if you omit the path, then it's just going to be applied to all of your requests. So if I were to remove the path, now it's going to be applied to home,